Barikalust, Baridesang. It's wonderful to be in Hayastan after, 38 years was my last visit. And it was very unusual. I want to share that experience with you because I came with my mother, who was a survivor of the genocide from a village north of Diyarbakir. And we came with a group of survivors, almost all women. And I was the youngest by about 40 years in this group. So it was, culturally, it was a very odd situation, you know. And but we traveled around the country. It meant a lot for my mother to see Hayastan. And at that time, you know, I didn't go to the Genocide Memorial. I spent most of the day today there, and it was very moving, I must say, even though I'm very familiar with the history. I thought it was very tastefully done and understated. So I appreciated that. Anyway, I'm going to talk about Iran, your neighbor, by the way, a country which has been the focus of U.S. foreign policy for many, many decades. And U.S. policy in the Middle East, and of course in Iran also, is driven by one factor and one factor only, and that's oil. So all this talk about freedom, democracy, women's rights, human rights, it's all bullshit, as we say in American English. You know, it's absolute propaganda. The real interest is oil, and it begins with Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1945, meeting with Ibn Saud on a U.S. destroyer in the Suez Canal, and it was at that meeting that the U.S. made an agreement with Saudi Arabia. It was a Faustian bargain with the devil. The U.S. agreed to support and protect the feudal regime of the Saudi family in return for U.S. corporations having exclusive access to the oil of Saudi Arabia, which was described in U.S. State Department documents as the greatest source of strategic wealth in the history of the world. And so Washington was determined to get that, control it, and incidentally at the same time to drive the British and the French out from the region. They weren't allowed to have access to that oil. Now, oil had also been discovered in Iran many years earlier, actually, and the U.S. had a close relationship with Iran until the election of Mohammad Mossadegh in 1950, or yeah, it was 1950. He was actually the Time Magazine Man of the Year in 1950. Now, Mossadegh had some very unusual ideas. Maybe he didn't understand how the real world works. That when Washington says jump, you jump. You know, when Washington says sing, you sing. So Mossadegh thought that the oil wealth of Iran should benefit the Iranian people. What a crazy idea. But this, of course, this was a radical idea. Almost all of the money from the oil wealth of Iran was going to banks in London and New York, and very little left for the Iranian people. And Mossadegh's message was very popular. The Shah fled the country, that's Reza Pahlavi, and in 1952, the American president was pressured by Winston Churchill, who was then the Prime Minister of Britain, to overthrow Mossadegh. Why? Churchill told President Truman he was a communist. He was a slave to the Russians. If you allow his action to go unchecked, other countries will get the same idea. This is a very interesting theme in U.S. foreign policy. It's called the threat of a good example. So if one country succeeds, like little Nicaragua or El Salvador, then it will spread to other countries. So it has to be controlled, it has to be crushed. And so Truman, the president in 1952, said, no, we're not going to get involved in Iran. But the next year, a new president came to power, Eisenhower, and he agreed to overthrow the regime of Mossadegh. This was called Operation Ajax. It was a coup d'etat completely organized by Washington and the Central Intelligence Agency under the direct orders of the White House. Before the coup, there was a sustained propaganda campaign aimed at the Iranian people and at global public opinion as well, that Iranians would have to learn Russian, their mosques would be closed, their religion will be very much controlled by Moscow, and these kinds of hysterical, exaggerated, propagandistic messages were spread to soften Iranian public opinion, but also to persuade people around the world. As always, Washington's intentions are noble and altruistic. They are for democracy and for freedom, and so they are doing a great thing by destroying democracy in Iran. So here you have this incredible contradiction of a democratically elected and popular Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, being overthrown by a criminal organization, the CIA, under the direction of the American president, and the reinstallation of the Shah, who had fled to Rome in exile, and he was flown back to Tehran in a CIA plane. That was the end of the democratic experiment in Iran. And so for the next 26 years, the Shah ruled Iran in a tyrannical manner with the help of the CIA and the Mossad from Israel, setting up a secret organization, a kind of mukhabarat called Sevak, and committed many human rights violations. Now, why do I say that? Actions have consequences. So by what the Americans did, the seeds that they planted in 1953, those seeds became fruit in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution. In the vocabulary of the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, this is called blowback. That is to say, the unintended consequences of U.S. foreign policy. It was not their goal to have an Islamic revolution in 1979 and the ascendancy of Ayatollah Khomeini. That was not the goal. The goal was to destroy Mossadegh and his movement. But in doing so, it created the possibility for an Islamic revolution to occur. This has happened over and over again with the United States. For those of you who were at my lecture on Tuesday, I talked about Afghanistan as another classic example of blowback. Here the US was supporting the Afghan Mujahideen that President Reagan called freedom fighters, and that Mujahideen turned later into the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Blowback, unintended consequences of US foreign policy. Now, Iran was a very important part of US domination of the Middle East, along with Turkey, Pakistan, and Israel, and Iran. Notice, all four non-Arab States. They were part of the security arrangement to control this region, again, because of oil and natural gas. So the loss, in quotes, of Iran was a big blow to U.S. imperialism, because it was one of the strongest allies that the United States had. So immediately, with the advent of the Islamic Revolution in 1979, the U.S. became totally opposed to the government, to the regime in Tehran. A year after the revolution, Iraq invades Iran. And what does the United States do? The defender of freedom and democracy and international law and human rights and the sovereignty of states to have their frontiers not violated. It didn't say a word about Saddam Hussein invading Iraq. In fact, they gave billions of dollars to the dictator of Iraq. They gave him intelligence, information, all kinds of credits, and crucially, weapons. So the helicopters that were used against the Kurdish Iraqi population by Saddam Hussein in 1988, those were US-made helicopters. The Halabja attack could not have happened without US support. That's another example of the double standards that the United States practices on a regular basis. It's one set of rules for the master and another set of rules for the servants. If the servants behave and kiss the master's hands, you will be taken care of. We'll look out for you, we'll provide you with everything you need. But the moment you turn against me, you're done. You're finished. Do you remember the movie The Godfather with Marlon Brando? In the opening scene, the man comes to him for some justice for his daughter. And so the Godfather says, "Of course, I will look after you. I'll take care of this issue. You have to kiss my hand. And now you will owe me anything you need in the future, you come to me. As long as you're loyal to me, I will be loyal to you. The moment you change your mind, it's over for you." Like that. And this, I think, people in the region have seen for many, many decades. Being opposed to any kind of independent Arab nationalism was resisted by the U.S. Nasser in Egypt and other nationalist movements, Bourguiba in Tunisia. This was, again, seen as a threat to the monarchies that the U.S. was protecting. Now, just a few weeks ago, our great president, I'm saying that as a joke, who certainly rivals Socrates and Aristotle in intellectual achievements, more jokes. He was in Saudi Arabia. Remember dancing with the emirs and all the pashas there? And here he was in Saudi Arabia 2 days after Iran had a national election in which the president, Rouhani, was re-elected by a large majority. Now, is Iran a perfect state? No. Is it a paradigm of human rights? No. Does it have lots of internal problems? Yes. Actually, I could ask those questions of the United States and give the same answer. Yes. But compared to the United Arab Emirates, compared to Kuwait, compared to Saudi Arabia, Iran is a much better place to be. I know I made this joke on Tuesday, but there were some people here who didn't hear it. If a Saudi woman went to sleep tonight and woke up tomorrow in Iran, she would think she's in heaven, because she could own property, she could get divorced, she could get custody of her children, she could have all kinds of privileges. She could drive a car, she could own property, she could have all types of privileges which are forbidden to her in Saudi Arabia. So not only did Trump not say anything about Iran's election, but he went on to say that Iran was the great evil in the Middle East. It was the reason that there is terrorism, and on and on and on. I'm quoting here, from Lebanon to Iraq to Yemen, Iran funds, arms, and trains terrorist militias and other extremist groups that spread destruction and chaos across the region. For decades, Iran has fueled the fires of sectarian conflict and terror. Interesting comment from, the Aristotle of our time, Donald Trump. For decades, it's the complete reversal of truth and history. Iran has been the victim of sectarian violence. Just look what happened yesterday in Tehran. Those were jihadi groups, probably ISIS, Daesh, that attacked the mausoleum of Ayatollah Khomeini, as well as the Iranian parliament, killing 15 Iranians and wounding many more. Trump, first of all, it took him 24 hours to make a comment, and then when he made a comment about it, he said that basically this is what the Iranians deserve. Because they spread terrorism, now they're the victims of that terrorism. I mean, totally insensitive and nonsensical comment from arguably one of the worst presidents in the history of the United States. I was asked this question in an interview recently. Is Donald Trump the worst president in American history? It's difficult to say, but he's coming very close to achieving that goal. And one can only imagine what is going to happen in the coming days. Iran has, when I was there, for example, in 2007, I was there again in 2016. In 2007, some jihadis crossed the border from Pakistan. Again, jihadis created because of the Afghan war that Reagan supported with the Mujahideen. They blew up a bus, killing 25 Iranians. The US had nothing to say about that. It was not considered an act of terrorism. And they went back to Pakistan, and they were never arrested or in any way prosecuted. There's a jihadi group in Pakistan called Jandala. They are the ones who carried that out, and they openly were boasting about it. They were bragging about it. During the Iran-Iraq war, in the last year particularly, 1988, the US aggressively supported Saddam Hussein. So here was this, great violator of women's rights, human rights, oppressor of the Kurds, the massacre of Halabja. But now the US was all out in the open because it looked like Iran was going to win. And during this period, the US Navy shot down an Iranian jetliner, Iran Air 655, killing all 290 Iranians on board. This plane was flying in international civilian airspace. There was a US destroyer in the Khalij, in the Gulf there, and it launched a rocket and destroyed this plane, killing everyone abroad. Now, it was very clear this was a civilian aircraft. It was not in any way threatening this US destroyer. Incidentally, 10,000 miles away from the United States. The US has its warships everywhere around the world. It's like a global link. But that's considered perfectly normal for the US to have its weapons, its troops. 70 years after the end of World War II, Much of Europe is still occupied by the US military. England, Italy, Spain, France, all of these countries have US military bases. Japan, South Korea. Of course, this is all to protect us from our enemies, which we are constantly reminded surround us and want to do us harm. So we have to have this mighty military machine all over the world with over 1,000 military bases. So this Iranian jet, now it's very interesting. You'll see the hypocrisy when the Ukrainian plane was shot down or crashed. How righteous the U.S. became about, this shows Putin's aggression, this shows that Russia is on the march, they're out of control, those kinds of things. But when the U.S. does it, it's a different matter altogether. And so in 1988, this Iranian plane is destroyed. All the evidence indicated that it was a civilian aircraft. Now, you may think, well, what happened to the commander of the U.S. Navy ship that launched this missile? Surely he was arrested, maybe even in prison, punished, lost his rank? No, none of those things. He was given a medal and honored by the U.S. government for doing a great job, killing 290 Iranians. Now, a few years after that, when George H.W. Bush was president, the first Bush, he was presented with evidence about what happened to that plane. And the evidence clearly showed it was a mistake, it was a war crime, and that the Iranians should be given compensation for what happened, reparations. What did he say? It's a classic example, I'm ashamed to say, of U.S. arrogance and hubris. Hubris that would make the Greeks, Sophocles and Aeschylus and the great playwrights, they wrote about this. George H.W. Bush said, "I don't care what the facts are, I will never apologize for the United States of America." So essentially he was, doing this to the Iranian people and to the rest of the world. And that attitude pervades U.S. policy vis-a-vis Iran and other countries today as well. Now, democracy is always a threat to plutocracy because it undermines its plutocracy's concentration of power, inequality of wealth, and other aspects of plutocracy. And so efforts are made, for example, in Iran in 1953, and other examples I could talk for hours about how many times the U.S. has undermined democracy around the world. Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, Salvador Allende in Chile, Chedi Jagan in Guyana. I mean, the list goes on and on. Whenever there have been democratic nationalist movements, the U.S. has sought to undermine them. And where there has been plutocracies and monarchies, such as in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, etc., the U.S. has been supporting those non-democratic states. Now, the media in the United States, of which I am part of, but I'm part of the independent, progressive, leftist media. I mean, I've described many bad things about the United States, particularly its foreign policy, but we also have some very good things. There's a possibility for expression. There's a possibility to speak out against the state and against corporate power. However, in recent years, there has been an expansion of censorship, an expansion of government surveillance. People like Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning, I don't know if you're familiar with them, they are so-called whistleblowers. They leak to the press, to the media, information that the state does not want people to know about. So, what was Chelsea Manning's crime? She got a video of US helicopters shooting up Iraqis in the middle of Baghdad. Not only shooting them up, these were unarmed people in the street, but laughing about it, making a joke about it. So, of course, Washington got very angry with that, because the narrative is always about US benevolence, US kindness, US support for the Iraqi people. The destruction of Iraq as a result of the 2003 invasion is one of the greatest war crimes ever committed. Anyone who has studied this issue has to come to this conclusion. There was no reason to invade Iraq, and the consequences have been catastrophic. First of all, for the Iraqi people, who have lost hundreds of thousands of dead, many more wounded and injured, many more internally exiled and externally exiled. I was just in Jordan 2 weeks ago. There are hundreds of thousands of Iraqis still in Jordan as refugees because of what has happened as a result of the US invasion. Did I support Saddam Hussein? Of course not. He was a tyrant and a despot. But if you ask most Iraqis today, and I've spoken to Iraqi refugees, would they prefer to be in Iraq under Saddam Hussein when there was general security? Or would they prefer the American liberation? Almost every single one of them will tell you things were better under Saddam Hussein. I've talked to Afghan men and women who say basically the same thing. They don't like the Taliban, but at least they said we were safe under the Taliban. Our children could go to school. We knew at the end of the school day they would come home. So there was a lot of, security was very, very important. More important than empty words like democracy and freedom and free market and having air-conditioned malls. Because if you ask a mother, is it more important that your children be safe or that you have an air-conditioned mall, what do you think the answer will be? It should be obvious. Security is more important than these material things. So the media in the US has some space within it in which I can operate. So about 250 radio stations broadcast my program, and I have 2 of them here, a new one with Noam Chomsky on neoliberalism, something you should know about because it's happening here in Hayastan and throughout the rest of the world. Neoliberalism, and the other talk is about with Thomas Frank on Trump. Who voted for Trump? I thought these Americans were so clever and so smart, they would never vote for someone like Donald Trump. So he explains in this program why and how Trump got so much support. So I've brought these, they're 1 hour each, and I want you to have them. So for the 2 programs, it's just 2,000 dirham. I hope you can get them. And make copies and spread them, listen to them, and give them to your friends as well. Antonio Gramsci was a great Italian Marxist and someone who's influenced my thinking. And he always said there are spaces in which you can operate and you can create alternatives. And that's what I did with alternative radio, which began in 1985, 86. And I had no encouragement from anyone. and I should tell some of the younger people here in the audience, I have no academic qualifications. I barely graduated from high school. I went 1 year to college and I quit. I'm only saying that because to do this kind of work, you don't need technical training. You just need to be skeptical, you need to be critical, and to think, carefully about who is in power, how are they gaining, and what role do the media play in that power structure. So we can create some spaces in these democratic societies. I don't want to say that the US is a totalitarian state, although it is showing more and more attributes of a totalitarian state, particularly when it comes to surveillance and wiretapping and email surveillance and that kind of thing. Harassment of journalists like myself. I haven't been arrested, but I've been interrogated by the security people many times. And of course, in neighboring Turkey, your favorite country, you have this issue of The Economist, Turkey's slide into dictatorship. Now, this has been something that's been going on in Turkey now for the last many years, particularly since the AKP party came to power under Erdogan. But now, since the failed coup of July 2016, it has become an openly totalitarian state. Hundreds of thousands of people have lost their jobs. Journalists have been censored, imprisoned, muzzled, sent into exile. There's a major human rights crisis going on in Turkey. And what is the United States doing? Well, you must think, the United States must be defending freedom and democracy and the free press and all of the ideals it loves to lecture Iran about. But when it comes to Turkey, they're completely asleep. They have nothing to say about the Turkish violation of human rights. Again, what is the reason? Do they love Turks? No, not necessarily. The main reason is the bloody Air Force base at Incirlik, near Adana. That is the main U.S. concern with Turkey, to have access to that military base. So while having access to that base, then they look away whenever there are human rights violations. There's a word for this in English, hypocrisy. You have one set of rules, as I said, for the master, and another set of rules for other people. So Iran, to go back to Iran, Washington lectures them all the time. You must do this, you must do that. You don't have freedom of the press. Where the exact same conditions appear, and in fact are worse in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, in other U.S. allies, and in Turkey, the U.S. says nothing. I mean, people around the world see this, and they see the double standard. And I think that brings shame on our country. Fortunately, we can still talk about it. But if the totalitarian tendencies of Donald Trump continue and accelerate, there may come a time in the very near future where that will change, where the U.S. itself will become despotic and tyrannical. I certainly hope that doesn't happen, and we have to fight against that. That's our boycott. That's our struggle, and we have to carry out that struggle. But it's important to resist tyranny and despotism and dictatorship wherever it may be around the world. And I think consistency is very, very important, because if people will respect you if you are consistent, not if you keep changing and the new card every day, a new set of rules every day. That's really important.